Welcome to the Feminist Park podcast. I'm Kwame.
And I'm Leilani. It's great to be kicking off this journey with you all today.
Yeah, we're diving into work that's really closely tied to the vision behind the Feminist Park project.
Imagining these truly equitable public spaces, starting with the idea for an intersectional feminist park right here in Berlin.
Exactly. And this podcast, well, it's kind of an extension of that. We're going to be digging into the academic research that, supports and informs that kind of vision.
We'll be taking these dense, sometimes quite academic papers and really pulling out the core and insights.
And looking at them through specific lenses, things like environmental justice, intersectionality, anti-colonial thought, queer theory.
All the stuff that helps us think critically about space.
Imagine a classroom or, a meeting room, maybe even just walking across a public park. And now imagine that your very existence in that space, your skin tone, your gender expression, your sexuality, isn't just tolerated. It actually functions as a necessary, a radical act of teaching. It's not just what you say, but the visual text of who you are.
That's such a transformative idea. It really flips the whole academic and social frame on its head.
It really does.
I mean, it forces us to stop seeing the body and identity as some kind of distraction from intellectual life.
Yeah, from the real work.
Exactly. Instead, they're crucial. They're equipment for teaching and for learning, especially, when those bodies are Black, queer, and female. It basically reframes survival itself as a form of pedagogy.
And that is precisely the powerful lens we're using for this deep dive. Today, we're immersing ourselves in Melissa Michelle Lewis's really foundational 2012 dissertation. It's called Body of Knowledge, Black Queer Feminist Thought, Performance, and Pedagogy.
And this source material is so much more than just an academic critique.
Oh, absolutely.
It's a meticulous blueprint. It details how marginalized scholars navigate hostility. And in doing that, they give us a kind of roadmap for how to design a truly liberated space.
Lewis's project is grounded in the lived realities and, the really strategic pedagogical work of three brilliant Black queer feminist scholars.
Right. She names them Dr. Mariposa, Professor Deborah, and then the author herself, Mel Michelle. And all three were operating in predominantly white institutions, or PWIs, which, as Lewis shows, are these structural sites of just constant negotiation and often outright hostility.
So our mission today is to really unpack that core argument, that the academic environment is a kind of high-stakes performance arena.
Right.
But the brilliant and, let's be honest, often exhausting methods these scholars use to just survive and thrive, I'm talking everything from performance art to tactical clothing choices.
And demeanor and discipline.
Exactly. All of it offers these critical, actionable lessons for us. And these lessons specifically give us the theoretical validation we need for designing any truly inclusive public space.
Including the feminist park, which is what this is all about.
We're
basically looking for the rules of engagement that these scholars had to develop for themselves.
Yeah.
Because those rules tell us exactly what marginalized individuals need to feel safe, to feel validated, and to feel powerful when they're occupying space in a majority world.
Okay, so let's start at the foundation of Lewis's work, this core idea of the body as text. For centuries, traditional Western academia, it's rooted in this Enlightenment idea of a deliberate split, a disarticulation between the mind and the body.
Right. The intellect is supposed to be neutral.
Yeah.
Detached. Objective.
But Lewis's whole argument is that for Black queer women, that pretense is just. Yeah. It's impossible.
It's not just impossible, it's actively dangerous. Lewis is so firm on this point that identity is completely inseparable from their pedagogy.
You can't separate them.
You can't. You cannot discuss what they teach without discussing who they are. M. Jackie Alexander said it back in 2004 that the Black gay body is already racially historicized, sexualized, physicalized, and demonized.
So the moment they walk into that PWI classroom, their body is already being read.
And misread.
And filtered through, centuries of negative stereotypes and institutional bias?
Yeah, and this is happening whether they want it to or not. Their body is the primary document that's being analyzed, and often, very poorly.
Lewis notes that her whole pedagogical project intentionally sits right at that intersection.
Women's studies, African-American studies.
Queer studies and performance studies. She says it plainly. Her identity as a woman, as Black, and as queer means she is, quote, both living at and teaching where these fields meet.
And that's such a profound commitment because it means her research is rooted in autoethnography, which is, the study of her own lived experience, which then demands that the primary tool for the project has to be intersectional analysis.
Yeah.
We hear that term all the time, but Lewis really grounds it in the work of Black feminist scholars. People like Patricia Hill Collins, Kimberly Crenshaw, and Bonnie Thornton Dill.
We should probably slow down here just to make sure we really get what intersectionality means in practice, at least how Lewis is defining it.
Good idea.
It's not just, I have multiple identities.
No.
Lewis outlines 3 main assertions. The first one is that these categories, race, class, gender, sexuality, they mutually construct one another. They're not independent variables.
Right. You're never just a woman. You're always a race woman, a class woman. They're woven together into this seamless tapestry of experience.
Exactly. And that leads to the second assertion, which is about how these woven identities actually show up in public space.
Lewis calls it the category popping.
Yeah, popping. So one category might become more dominant in a specific context.
Right, it might pop.
But it never exists or is experienced independently of the others.
Okay, so give me an example.
So a student might be focused primarily on the instructor's Blackness during a heated discussion about racial inequality. But that experience of Blackness is always mediated by the instructor's gender and her sexuality and her class. The whole identity is always there, even if only one part is the immediate focus of a conflict.
I see. So the whole tapestry is present, even if you're only looking at one thread.
Perfectly put. And then the third assertion, this is what raises the stakes from just personal experience to structural reality.
Right.
It's that these categories simultaneously structure relationships of power and, well, all aspects of sociocultural life.
And that's why she's looking at PWIs. Because they are the physical structures built on those exact power relationships.
And if you look at the historical context Lewis provides, the need for this kind of analysis becomes just devastatingly clear.
Yeah. I mean, this framework, it evolved from earlier concepts, right? Like Deborah King's multiple jeopardy.
Which recognize the cumulative burden of multiple oppressions.
Right. And most powerfully, from the radical identity politics of the Combahee River Collective in 1974.
We have to spend a moment on the Combahee River Collective. They are so foundational to this entire study.
Absolutely. Their declaration was a deeply radical political act.
They centered their own oppression as Black lesbian feminists as the very source of their politics. And the question is, why?
Well, because they lacked, and this is their words, racial, sexual, heterosexual, or class privilege. They had none of it.
It was a direct, and I mean a necessary response to complete erasure. They were arguing that if political movements based on race, like the civil rights movement, were prioritizing Black men,
and movements based on gender, like second-wave feminism, were prioritizing white women,
then the only way for the Black lesbian experience to become politically relevant was through intentional self-articulation.
Naming themselves.
Naming themselves and their location. And Lewis shows that this legacy is still alive today for these contemporary Black queer feminist scholars.
Which is the perfect entry point to this major structural challenge she calls the double cross.
The erasure of Black queer women within the very academic fields that were designed to study them.
It's a bitter paradox, right? Marginalization within the margins.
It is.
Lewis documents this so meticulously. Historically, Black queer studies often focus heavily on Black masculinities and gay male experiences.
Right.
And then, meanwhile, you have mainstream queer studies, which so often just defaults to a white male norm when it's talking about sexual identity and culture.
So what's the result?
Black queer women get marginalized even in the spaces they helped create and theoretically define. They get squeezed out from both sides.
Caught in the academic middle, Lewis argues this is a trend of erasure that you can trace along a cultural, intellectual, and historical continuum.
Yeah, she points out that even when anthologies on Black queer studies, intellectually pay homage to Black lesbian foremothers, they sometimes fail to really account for contemporary Black queer women's presence, especially when it comes to their specific pedagogical needs.
So this intentional self-articulation that we were talking about, it's not just about personal expression.
No, not at all. Lewis establishes it as a necessary political and academic intervention. It's a way to disrupt that double cross.
And all of this constant negotiation of identity, this risk of erasure, it's all happening within an already brutal structural reality in the PWI. Let's look at the hard data Lewis brings in about that structural challenge.
Structural barriers are just immense, and they show the consequences of these really deep institutional inequities.
So she cites U.S. Department of Education data from 2011.
Right, showing that in 2009, only 4.3% of doctoral degrees conferred in the entire U.S. went to black women.
4.3%.
It's an incredibly small number. And what it means is that the few who do make it into the academy are carrying this impossible weight of expectation.
And that underrepresentation translates directly into what Lewis, citing Danielle Conway, calls impossible demands.
If you're one of the few, you are immediately expected to be all things to all people.
It's the token role model.
The resource for every student of color, the ethnic rep on every committee.
The bridge to the community, the expert in every intersecting field.
Right. And you have to do all of that while also maintaining the exact same research output for tenure as your white male colleagues who face none of those external demands.
And there's data to show the penalty for that, right?
Oh, yeah. Lewis cites this painful longitudinal study from a 2008 Chronicle of Higher Education.
What did it find?
It quantified the structural penalty for all this labor. Black women were about twice as likely as members of other groups, including black men, to transfer from a tenure-track position to an adjunct or a research-only path.
Twice as likely.
They were just substantially less likely to be retained in those tenure-track positions.
So that's the academic penalty for emotional labor.
Precisely.
You spend all your energy mentoring, diversifying, bridging, and the institution that demands your presence for its diversity optics then turns around and penalizes you at tenure time for not focusing narrowly enough on traditional research.
And that's why the common advice you hear from white majority faculty, just say no to service requests, is so much more complex for minority faculty.
Right, because if they refuse, it might be seen as a lack of commitment to the community or to the students. It could damage their professional standing.
Lewis really drives this point home. The entire experience of black female faculty is shaped by these racialized and gendered assumptions about who is an insider and who is just being tolerated.
The outsider within status.
Exactly. It means they are constantly grappling with whose opinion is truly valued, who gets the benefit of the doubt, who gets mentored seriously. The entire structure is working against them while demanding their emotional and physical presence.
It paints a picture of the PWI as a space that is fundamentally extractive. It's pulling this essential labor from marginalized faculty, but refusing to grant them the corresponding institutional power or security. So now we can move from the theory to the intensely lived reality. Let's look at how Lewis's three scholars negotiate their identity as equipment in these hostile environments. Let's start with Dr. Mariposa. Lewis describes her as the genuine article of this intersectionality thing. She's a black, queer woman whose gender expression is masculine or butch.
And right away, Dr. Mariposa's presentation becomes a text for her students to read. She actually sees her butch expression as a tool, a way to teach about gender norms and fluidity.
But she faces this intense cognitive dissonance, especially from her white male colleagues.
Yeah, they often just erase her masculinity. They call her young lady.
Which has to be so painful. She says, it grates on me because my masculinity is a key part of my identity.
Her full being is made invisible. They see a female body, they apply a traditional diminutive gender label, and that's it.
It's a perfect example of that intersectional failure in real time. They read her as black and female, but they completely fail to read her masculinity and her queer identity.
Right. And she says the only person she feels really sees her integrated identity is one black male colleague.
And there's an unspoken understanding there.
Yes, of her as a masculine black person, which just points to the incredible isolation within the PWI. That true recognition is so rare, and it often only comes from a shared minority experience.
But the politics of this, they change drastically when she's in the classroom dealing with students and curriculum. She identifies her master status, the part of her identity that draws the most fire in the classroom, as race.
Which is fascinating.
Yeah.
Because you might assume it would be her gender expression.
You would. But she says she finds it safer to push on gender and sexuality because when she brings up race, the students they shut down or they become openly hostile.
So it's a vital tactical decision for her pedagogical survival.
Absolutely.
She says because she discusses racial inequality, she gets buckback from students. The tension, the kind of explosiveness is around race. They're way less reactive to her being queer than they are to critiques of systemic racial power.
And this choice, to focus on the less explosive identity just to keep the dialogue going, it's a self-protective strategy.
But one that comes at a cost.
A huge cost. This constant exposure to racial hostility leads to what Lewis identifies as this intense labor of containment.
Right. Dr. Mariposa talks about the emotional labor required to just not register or look appalled when students come out with these racist or classist microaggressions.
And can you imagine the psychological toll of that containment?
She gives specific examples. Students calling black men ghetto, or white students who insist on looking at everything through a false reverse discrimination lens.
And what did she do?
She literally has to stockpile these experiences. She buries them deep inside because she just can't respond to every single one. It's impossible.
Because if she reacted authentically, she'd risk being immediately cast in that controlling image of the angry black woman.
Which would derail the entire learning process and put her own authority at risk.
So she has to perform this kind of professional neutrality, but that neutrality is bought at the cost of her own emotional and psychological well-being.
It's a profound asymmetry of labor in that classroom. She is expending all this energy to manage their discomfort while they are completely free to express their hostility.
And right there, that's a direct input for public space design. If a PWI requires this level of containment just to survive,
then the feminist park has to be designed to eliminate the need for that kind of exhaustive emotional labor.
Okay, let's transition now to the second scholar, Professor Deborah. Her strategy is very different. It revolves around proactive boundary setting, managing her petite stature, and confronting these perceptions of innocence.
Right. Professor Deborah is petite, and she's very conscious of this. She actively performs largeness to counter the problems she anticipates from being black, female, and petite.
She refuses to be diminished by the space or by people's preconceptions.
Her mantra is, I am 10 feet tall. It's this proactive, embodied pedagogical tool.
It's such a compelling claim to space. It's rooted in her awareness that her physical body, in that PWI context, could easily be read as dismissible.
Yeah, she asserts command over the room. There's that great anecdote about her student's grandfather.
Oh, right. He meets her and says something like, "But my God, I thought you were 10 feet tall."
And without missing a beat, she retorts, I am 10 feet tall.
It's this physical performance that establishes her confidence and authority against all these structural expectations.
Her colleagues, though, they read her integrated identity in these really complex and often self-serving ways.
She identifies as an African feminist lesbian.
Right, and she notes that the administration seems to favor hiring black gay faculty, but she suspects it's because they're seen as less antagonistic around race.
Wow. So her queer identity is, ironically, being used to, neuter the discussion around race?
That's how she puts it. It allows her white colleagues to avoid confronting this deep, historical American racial critique.
So this speaks to the dynamic of the innocent black queer.
Yes. Professor Deborah feels her assertive critiques are sometimes framed as coming from an exotic or foreign ethnicity rather than African-American anger.
So if her blackness is read as being from somewhere else, somewhere non-American.
Her critical comments become acceptable. They're palatable. Whereas similar critiques from her African-American colleagues might be dismissed as just chip-on-the-shoulder anger.
That is an incredibly insidious form of acceptance.
It is. Her assertiveness is only okay because it's been exoticized, and we see this complexity pop up in, intimate boundary negotiations, too.
Right. She deals with this constant confusion around race, gender, and sexuality in just daily, mundane interactions.
That awkward hug scenario she talks about captures it perfectly.
Remind me of that one.
She was at a faculty social hour, and a white female colleague kind of hesitated before greeting her physically.
Like she was unsure of the protocol.
Exactly, unsure of the appropriate racial or sexual protocol for a physical greeting. And then she just quickly moves on to hug another white woman, leaving Professor Deborah just standing there.
And the hesitation itself is the microaggression.
It screams, I don't know how to relate to your whole self. And this continuous grappling with her identity by other people on campus, it's just tiring.
She says, there's no place in which I am normal anywhere on the planet. It's just tiring.
And that's the lived cost of being an intersectional pioneer.
Which directly informs her approach to visibility and performance. She explicitly refuses to perform for the LGBTQ student group.
Specifically for National Coming Out Day, right?
Right, because she feels it forces her into the role of a circus performer.
And that's a powerful act of resistance. It's a resistance to the expectation that marginalized individuals have to repeatedly enact their oppression for the benefit and education of the majority.
So what does she advocate for instead?
For living her identities. As a steady, integrated model, she wants her stable presence to be the pedagogy, not some kind of scheduled show.
Okay, now let's turn to the author herself, Mel Michelle. Her navigation of the Academy highlights what Lewis calls the femme paradox and the strategic use of disclosure.
Mel Michelle, identifies as a queer, feminist, lesbian Southern belle.
A lot going on there.
A lot. And her femme appearance is seen as less transgressive than a masculine presentation like Dr. Mariposa's. And this affords her a specific kind of safety and privilege in enunciating her lesbian identity.
So she might be seen as easier to approach.
Maybe. But that perceived safety comes with a heavy cost.
Which is?
Constant outing. Students frequently default to dyke denial or just ignore her sexual orientation entirely because her presentation doesn't fit the visual stereotype of a lesbian.
So it's this paradox. Her appearance gives her safety in the hallways, but it requires constant active labor in the classroom to maintain her queer visibility.
Exactly. It's a trade-off between perceived transgression and visibility.
And how does she handle that?
She actually converts that labor into a pedagogical technique through affinity.
What do you mean by that?
She actively uses personal narratives. So she'll recount her personal connection to the Combahee River Collective or share her own experiences related to the texts they're reading. She embraces the uncanny resemblance between her life and the material.
She doesn't hide from that blurring of the lines.
No, she leans into it. Lewis notes that this sometimes leads to students calling assignments things like your book or your poem.
Wow.
And Mel Michelle uses that student recognition as a springboard for their own reflexivity. She invites them to consider their own relationship to the material rather than treating it like some distant, objective thing.
So she's consciously walking this line. She mobilizes her Black queer body as a visible, lived text.
But she continuously draws students back to the theoretical and historical readings. Her life validates the theory, and the theory helps students understand her life. It's a feedback loop.
And finally, let's talk about her classroom management strategy because it's brilliant. The candy penalty.
Yes, a textbook example of transforming power dynamics through performance.
So what is
The candy penalty addresses minor discipline issues, specifically cell phone use, while actively avoiding that dreaded angry Black woman stereotype.
So if a student is caught texting or their phone rings?
Mel Michelle playfully teases them and requires them to apologize by bringing candy for the entire class at the next session.
And that's key. It transforms punishment, which usually isolates the offender,
into peer accountability and community building. The focus shifts away from the instructor's potentially misread anger and onto the student's responsibility to the collective.
It's a feminist practice. It maintains boundaries without relying on punitive authority or, stereotype enforcement.
And these three scholars, Dr. Mariposa with her containment, Professor Deborah with her 10-foot assertion, and Mel Michelle with her self-disclosure and community discipline, they just show that surviving the PWI requires a highly calibrated performative genius.
Okay, so these strategies weren't just about coping.
No, not at all.
Lewis shows they are active, conscious, feminist pedagogies. They're designed to fundamentally dismantle traditional hierarchical power structures within the classroom.
The classroom is a microcosm of the PWI itself.
Exactly. So let's look at how they challenge didactic authority.
The foundation of that challenge is really rooted in mutual learning. It borrows from Paulo Freire's assertion that true education has to solve the teacher-student contradiction.
So that both are simultaneously teachers and students.
Right. The instructor has to shift from being the sole possessor of knowledge to being a guide who learns alongside the students.
And Professor Deborah really embodies this. She refuses to provide what she calls the right answer.
So what happens when students ask her for it?
She tells them, go look it up. You have to take responsibility for finding out what turns you on, not just what I think is important.
And she notes that this causes a lot of anxiety for them.
Of course. They're conditioned to rely on authority. But she sees it as essential for fostering their own self-directed intellectual development.
And this push for equality, it extends to the physical design of the learning space, right?
It does. Dr. Mariposa uses circle seating in her smaller classes to make the setup less hierarchical.
So everyone can see each other.
Right. You are not looking at the back of people's heads. And even though the power dynamic isn't completely gone, they all still know she's the professor. The physical configuration shifts the environment towards a more collective knowledge production.
The next crucial pedagogical tool is this idea of using experience as evidence. In traditional PWI research, subjective, marginalized experience is often just dismissed. It's anecdotal or it lacks rigor.
Right.
But Lewis highlights that Black queer studies, Scholars have to rely on what Philip Bryan Harper calls speculative knowledge or felt intuition.
Especially where concrete, quantifiable evidence just might not exist to document things like microaggressions or subtle biases.
We should probably unpack felt intuition a little bit.
Good idea.
It's about validating the knowledge that's produced from the standpoint of the outsider within. Lewis uses Harper's powerful anecdote of the train ride to illustrate it.
Right. Harper details intuitively sensing the thoughts of this middle-aged white man who was attracted to him.
But then awkwardly retreated when he realized Harper was African American.
And there's no way to prove what that white man was thinking. There's no empirical evidence.
None. But the felt intuition that comes from lived experience, the analysis of body language, of context, of racial history, that provides a critical foundation for cultural criticism.
So Lewis is arguing that accepting this subjective knowledge as valid evidence is fundamental to feminist and queer pedagogy.
Yes, especially when you're discussing experiences of oppression that are often intentionally made invisible to the majority.
And Lewis also emphasizes enactment and embodiment. We touched on Dr. Mariposa's performance art approach,
Where she used her masculine, rounded guise to critique those hyper-feminine advertising poses. She was troubling normative gender.
She transforms a visual critique into an embodied text.
Which is very much in line with bell Hooks's view of teaching as a performative act that offers space for chance, invention, spontaneous shifts.
Dr. Mariposa is using her body as equipment to make the possibilities of the gender spectrum visible.
Exactly. Her heroic masculinity, produced by a black female body, actively challenges the institutional idea that gender performance has to fit some singular, authentic, or non-threatening version.
And finally, these scholars developed these really essential skills in managing conflict and vulnerability.
In ways that protect their authority but also keep the dialogue open.
Dr. Mariposa, for example, recognizing the hostility around race, uses humor. She intentionally keeps students off balance about her identity to disarm them.
Right, to make them more receptive to difficult material. She mentioned that sharing parts of her middle-class background helped break down barriers with white middle-class students.
Though she also recognized that risked alienating others who might see her as performing assimilation.
It's a constant negotiation. And then there's Mel Michel's linguistic policing, which is just a tactical masterpiece.
When students use slurs like coloreds or illegals,
She avoids that immediate condemnation that would just trigger defensive shame.
instead she responds with these very measured phrases like, "We might think about that idea using different language."
Which gives the student the benefit of the doubt. Maybe they just lack the appropriate discourse. But it still sets a clear, non-negotiable boundary for what's acceptable.
And that careful calibration is so critical. It avoids instantly invoking shame or guilt, which Professor Deborah also tries to manage with her students.
The dialogue remains open and productive, and she maintains her pedagogical authority without ever falling into the angry black woman trap.
The cumulative insight here is just wow. The successful pedagogy of these scholars is this highly sophisticated form of public relations management combined with intellectual rigor.
They have to constantly manage the external perception of their bodies while simultaneously delivering advanced critical analysis. It's a double job.
So we've spent all this time dissecting the challenges these black, queer, feminist pedagogues face every day.
The constant self-regulation, boundary negotiation, the fear of performance fatigue, the impossible demands.
And this entire analysis, it provides the necessary blueprint for designing liberated space.
The struggles in the PWI provide the ultimate validation for why the feminist park is so necessary.
I mean, the sheer exhaustion detailed in Lewis's work.
The need to fend off microaggressions, the requirement to perform specific identities just for survival.
The demand to be all things to all people.
It all confirms that what is desperately needed is a public space where simple presence doesn't automatically equal mandatory performance, or danger, or emotional labor.
So let's translate these individual strategies into concrete design principles. We can start with Professor Deborah having to consciously perform largeness just to counter the problems she anticipates. This gives us our first principle, designing for inherent non-threatening presence.
Okay, so what does that mean in practice for the feminist park?
It means the park has to be designed so that safety and respect don't rely on an individual's personal performance of authority or their physical size, or their demeanor.
So the built environment itself has to do that work.
Exactly. The sightlines, the staffing presence, the clear rules of engagement, they all have to mitigate the structural biases that lead people to anticipate problems based on marginalized identities.
So maybe things like well-lit, open transitional spaces or visible, non-hierarchical community management stations. Things that replace the need for an individual to have to perform largeness just to claim authority.
Exactly. We also need to address that structural tendency to penalize women of color through service overload, which Lewis documented.
Right. Professor Deborah's experience of Black faculty being given a disproportionate number of problem students.
That's a perfect example of how structural racism manifests as unfair, draining emotional labor.
So that informs a second principle: equitable distribution of emotional labor and resources.
Meaning, the park's governance and staffing have to actively fight that PWI tendency to overload women of color with management or mentorship roles just because they're good at it.
Right. So if the park offers resources or programming, the distribution of those responsibilities has to be equitable and visible and accountable.
Service demands should be transparent and rotational, not just falling on marginalized community members by default.
This isn't just about workload, though. It's about institutional integrity. If the park is staffed by women of color, they need to be supported and compensated for their wisdom, not just exhausted by endless service.
Absolutely. Now let's move to Dr. Mariposa's labor of containment, her need to stockpile microaggressions to avoid being cast as the angry Black woman.
This gives us a third principle: spatial and governance mechanisms for safe expression.
In the PWI, Dr. Mariposa has to contain her genuine, appalled reaction.
So the feminist park, conversely, has to provide clear mechanisms for processing conflict and microaggression that don't penalize the victim for expressing natural emotional responses.
What would that look like?
Well, it might translate to specific design components, maybe designated conflict resolution areas governed by mediators who are trained in non-punitive accountability.
Or maybe anonymous, documented feedback loops for microaggressions that are actually taken seriously by the park's governance.
Exactly. Allowing individuals to release those stockpiled experiences safely without risk to their authority or their physical body. The space itself has to absorb and process the conflict rather than forcing the victim to contain it.
Now consider Mel Michel's candy penalty,
The way she transformed discipline into peer accountability and community repair.
which gives us the principle of communal accountability and restorative discipline.
Okay, so in the park, the governance rule should mirror this. Traditional public space rules so often rely on punitive, state-enforced, shaming behavior management.
The equivalent of stern academic authority.
Right. So the park instead should prioritize restorative justice models. If a minor community boundary is crossed, the consequence should involve communal contribution, not exile or shame.
The penalty should repair the social contract, not just punish the individual.
And crucially, we have the need for integrated identity expression without risk.
This comes from Mel Michel's intentional self-disclosure and Professor Deborah's refusal to be a circus performer.
Which gives us our principle of visibility without vulnerability.
The park must facilitate integrated identity expression that is central to one's identity without requiring a spectacle or posing a risk.
So it means providing spaces for both quiet reflection and collective celebration. It should encourage spontaneous, normalized expression of identity, a subtle embrace of a partner, a public discussion of a non-normative identity, without compelling people to stage a performance for majority validation.
You know, Lewis noted that profound cognitive failure of the PWI.
The way white majority colleagues fail to grasp intersectionality. They read one identity while ignoring others.
They see gender, but they miss race, or they see race, but they miss masculinity.
So therefore, the ultimate design principle for the feminist park has to be this: architecture as intersectional pedagogy.
The physical space itself, the way pathways intersect, the art, the signage, the names, must actively force the comprehensive intersectional reading of every person who enters.
So the space has to reflect the complexity of human existence. It has to ensure that no part of someone's identity, race, gender, sexuality, ability is structurally erased or made dangerous just by occupying the space.
Lewis's work shows the importance of creating new knowledges produced for, by, and about Black women.
The feminist park's goal can't just be a respite from oppression.
No, it has to be a proactive setting where the community can engage in the kind of forward-looking work Audre Lorde demanded. redefining ourselves and devising realistic scenarios for altering the present and constructing the future.
The strategies of these scholars, their ability to survive hostile spaces using their embodied intellect, they're not just personal survival guides.
They are the essential architectural specifications for building a liberated future.
They tell us exactly what kind of atmosphere allows for true flourishing, where identity is treated as a resource, not a vulnerability.
The PWI classroom, as Lewis documented it, is a battleground of singular, non-intersectional readings of identity.
So the feminist park has to be designed to correct that structural and cognitive failure, just by its very existence and operation.
This deep dive into Lewis's body of knowledge really confirms that the body of a Black, queer, feminist pedagogue serves as an uncomfortable truth in the academy. Their strategic existence reveals exactly how deeply power dynamics are rooted in physical space and institutional structure.
And we've seen that their strategies, from Professor Debra's 10-foot claim to authority to Dr. Mariposa's tactical use of masculine performance and Mel Michel's communal candy penalty, are just indispensable blueprints.
They show us how to create spaces where identity is consciously used as a resource, rather than constantly navigated as a source of vulnerability and exhaustion.
And the central key takeaway for us, and for anyone designing an inclusive public sphere, is this. The true measure of a liberated public space is not whether it merely tolerates difference.
It's a much higher bar than that.
A much higher bar. We have to ask whether it actively eliminates the exhausting, draining, emotional labor required by marginalized individuals simply to occupy that space.
Liberation means being able to show up and just be, without having to prepare for an intellectual or physical battle every time you walk out the door.
And that leads us to our final provocative thought, which builds directly on Lewis's foundational work.
Okay.
If the predominantly white institution is a physical manifestation of a structural failure to read the whole person, a place where identities are perpetually misread or erased, how can we design spaces like the Feminist Park that through their architecture, their governance, and their communal rules actively force the comprehensive intersectional reading of every single person who enters?
To ensure that no part of their identity is overlooked or erased or made dangerous.
The design itself has to become the pedagogy. It's about building a space that teaches intersectionality just by virtue of its existence.
It's a profound challenge. But as Lewis shows us, the knowledge for that design already resides within the bodies that have had to fight the hardest for their right to be seen.
Indeed. It's about ensuring the physical environment reflects the complexity and the dignity of the human condition.
So that the outsider within status becomes obsolete.
A truly critical goal.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the body of knowledge. We'll see you next time.
This knowledge is a tool, really. A tool for seeing your city differently, and potentially for helping to change it.
It's been a really insightful deep dive, I think. This document provides such a vital framework, especially for projects like the Feminist Park Project that are trying to build something fundamentally different. It shows just how interlinked urban design and social justice are.
It really does. But it also shows the scale of the challenge, right? It requires sustained effort, real commitment, and a genuine willingness to shift power dynamics in how cities get made and managed.
Definitely. It makes you think about how we ensure those voices, the ones that have been excluded, are actually heard and centered.
There's another quote from Sarah Ahmed that feels relevant here.
Go on.
She says, "If you have to shout to be heard, you are heard as shouting."
That's powerful.
It makes you ponder, doesn't it? How can the design of public space itself work differently? How can it amplify the voices of those who've been historically silenced, ensuring their needs are met without them having to shout just to be noticed?
How can design itself listen? That's a really provocative thought to end on.
A lot to think about.
Indeed. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.